Okay, awesome. So last week was an introduction. We spoke about what Tanya is, where it comes from, what its goals are, what it aims to accomplish. For anyone who wasn't here, let's just say that the book that we're about to start studying is probably the original Jewish self-help book. It's based 100% in Torah. It was written in the 1700s before Freud. So even though you might find a lot of parallels to modern psychology, this book actually predated what we know as modern psychology. So it's really fascinating to see some of these concepts that come directly from Torah, things that Jewish people have been studying for thousands of years. For most of us know the story of Genesis, where God says on the sixth day, right before he creates people, what does he say? Anyone know the quote? He says, "Let us make man." And it's been like, it's been discussed, really for thousands of years. Like, what does that even mean? Like, who's God talking to? Let us make man? Like, did he have helpers making people? Like, and obviously there's a lot of commentary, but I heard today someone explain that perhaps God says to every person, it's like a message that God says to us on our life journey. He says, come on, let's make a mensch out of you. Like, we have a project. We're partners in this project. I gave you all the raw materials, but I need your help. Let's make you into the Yiddish terminology mensch, which literally translates to person, is really to mean like a good person, an upstanding person, the best version of you that there is. So the Tanya gives us, it's like the manual to this journey. How do we become the best version of ourselves? That's what the goal of the Tanya, what it's aiming to do. I want to just put in a note that I really don't want this class to be a monologue. I invite questions and I invite comments. Sometimes I'll specifically ask if anyone has any questions or comments, but if you have any questions or comments at any point, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask. Sometimes I see the hand signals and sometimes I don't notice them. So feel free to unmute yourself if there's something that you want to ask or clarify. And that being said, we also, yes.
Who wrote the Tanya?
Who wrote the Tanya? His name was Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi. I can send that, I can type that up for you if you'd like. That being said, because I want us to just remain mindful that we're trying to move in a certain direction and actually cover ground. So if you suspect that your question is something that's a little bigger than within the context, something that will lead to a whole side discussion, or whether it's directly connected or not directly connected, then I prefer that those kind of questions, let's leave them towards the end, because we all love discussion and we could just stay on and discuss anything that's on your mind. But please, if you do have a question or a comment with what we're studying, please pipe up and tell us, because I do want it to be in discussion. One thing that we mentioned last time is that the Tanya is applied Kabbalah, meaning it's taking Kabbalistic concepts that are really esoteric and hard to understand and don't seem very practical, and it utilizes them in a very practical way and really guides us into how to utilize this knowledge of Kabbalah to guide our own life. So if we leave it in the academics, it won't become applied and practical. So it's important that we do make it into a conversation, that we don't just kind of listen and take notes and, put the notebook back on our shelves. So I hope that we can strike that balance where we're also discussing, and at the same time, we're also kind of moving along and making progress. So it's not only a discussion group, but we actually are moving along through the Tanya. My general aim is approximately one chapter a week. I know a few people ask me about this, but we're not in a rush. Like there's no deadlines, if a certain chapters will take us a little longer and we'll spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks on a chapter. Some chapters we'll go through quickly and maybe we'll do 2 chapters in 1 week. We're not like, committed to any specific time frame. I think we mentioned this before. There's different ways, like, let's say you're going to explore a forest. There's different ways to appreciate the forest, right? You can put on your hiking gear and get in from the edge of the woods and start walking through, and you have all your tools and your magnifying glass, and you check out every leaf and every flower and every branch, and like you're literally moving, 1 foot every few minutes. And it's beautiful, it's fascinating. It will take you a few years to get to the other side of the forest. Then there's the other extreme where you fly an airplane over the forest or a helicopter and you see a lot of it. You don't see all those details. At the same time, there's some things you see when you're kind of far out there that you don't see when you're in it. It's like, oh, you start seeing the patterns and the shape and, the mountains that maybe you wouldn't see when you're on the ground. I like to think that the approach we're taking is like the drone view. Like we're not high up there on a helicopter. We're also not reading line by line and analyzing every single word of the text, because that's amazing, but it would take us like 10 years to get through the Tanya. So I'm kind of trying to strike a balance where we want to go over like all the main concepts and we want to stop whenever there's a question or we really feel the need to discuss. But we want to like cover the forest. We really want to get an idea of what this forest looks like, not just our little, neck of the woods where we're stuck hiking. So that's the general approach of how we're going to go through it. A question for everyone here: who has studied the beginning parts of Tanya before? Because some of you guys have been here from way in the beginning. Who has never studied any Tanya before? And who studied some Tanya? So you see that we're coming from all different backgrounds, right? With some people have done a lot before, some people have done a little, some people have done none. I want to recommend that we kind of take a moment to pretend that none of us have ever studied Tanya before. Like, let's go into it with an open mind, with like a fresh outlook, myself included. Like, let's look at this as something new. And I think that will give us the ability to really gain the most. Like, let's just walk into this fully curious. Like, what is this book? What's it going to teach me? Okay, I'm ready to start. Any questions before we actually start inside the Tanya? Okay, let's go for it then. So the first word of Tanya, anyone know what the first word is? Those of you who have the text? The very first word is Tanya. Tanya literally means in Aramaic, we have learned, because the Tanya begins in typical Jewish academic study. It begins by like quoting different things that are written in the Mishnah and the Talmud and different parts of Torah. But we know also that the first word really is very powerful. And it kind of contains a lot, like the whole essence of Tanya is contained within this word. Actually, the author of the Tanya never named his book Tanya. He called it the Book of the Intermediate, the Sefer Shel Beinonim. He called it Lekutei Amarim, which means collection of writings. He never called it Tanya, but its most popular name today is Tanya, which is really just the first word in there. So it's interesting, if we examine that word alone, there were two interesting things I want to say about that word. So this is something new I learned. I never knew this before when studying Tanya. There is a Kabbalistic teaching that there is a demonic force in the world whose purpose is to stop people from delving too deeply into things. When we get like reluctant to like, oh, I don't want to get into all that esoteric stuff. Like, just give me the basics. Like, I don't want to go too deep. I'm not one of those people. We also are like worried about getting too deep into ourselves sometimes, like whatever, don't start analyzing me. I don't want to start analyzing my personality, my insides, like whatever. I'm just doing my best and don't ask me too many questions. I don't want to expose too much of myself. And the author of the Tanya, with his knowledge of Kabbalah, he said, I am going to counter this force head on. Like, before we get into this, I'm going to use this word as the opening of the Tanya, because I want to start off by saying, let's take away this fear. We are going to go deep into ourselves, into the world, to really understand what it's all about. So that was something new to me in this cycle of studying Tanya. The other thing that's interesting about Tanya, if you look at the Hebrew letters of the word Tanya and you flip them around, you get the word Eitan. It's the same Taf Nun Yud Aleph, and you flip it around. For those who read Hebrew, Aleph Yud Taf Nun spells Eitan. Eitan means strength. Um, there is a Kabbalistic teaching that there is a part of our soul that is the etan of the soul. It's that strong, powerful, enthusiastic part of our soul, the part of us that's on fire. Now, most of us don't access this part of us sometimes. Maybe when we were young, we were idealistic, different stages in our life, maybe we were like, oh, like into things. And the author of the Tanya says, no, I want to turn on that etan of your soul. I want to tap into that inner strength, that inner passion, the inner fire that you have. So starting with this word, the author's telling us, I don't want this to be just a book that you study. It's not just an academic study. This book is taking you through the process of revealing the innermost part of you, and really tapping into the strength, the passion, and the fire that's inside every one of us. So that's kind of the goal of the book, of where it's heading to. But let's start by actually reading the Tanya inside. We're going to read that first little paragraph together. Let me see. Okay. So I'm going to read the bold English letters. The Hebrew is on the other side for those who want to follow, but I think everyone here speaks English. So let's focus on the English without translating. The bold letters are the actual words of the Tanya. The not bold letters are explanations of the Tanya. So we're going to read through the bold letters. This is how the Tanya begins. Tanya, we have learnt. We have learnt, it's quoting from the Talmud. An oath is administered to him. Be righteous and be not wicked. And even if the whole world, judging you by your actions, tells you that you are righteous, regard yourself as wicked. These are the opening words of the Tanya. The Tanya is coming here to address and tell us, okay, I want to know, who am I? What's my purpose? Why am I here in this world? I think we all go through times when we ask ourselves these kind of questions. So the Tanya says, well, let's start at the very beginning. Let's start before you were born. Judaism teaches us that our soul is given to us at conception. So when a little baby is born, their soul has been within them for 9 months and has been preparing to enter this world all this time. The Talmud tells us, and this is, again, it's a Kabbalistic teaching, and it tells us that right before childbirth, that special magical moment when a little baby's about to be born, the angels pull the soul aside and have a little conversation with the soul and tell the soul, all right, you got to make a promise. And what's your promise? I'm going to be righteous and I'm not going to be wicked. I'm going to be good. I'm going to do the right thing. And even if everyone else tells me that I'm great and amazing and I'm, the best there is, I should always keep in mind that actually I'm not all that great. So before we analyze this, I think it's interesting. The Tanya starts with this line. The Tanya is really telling us this book is about you. And let's talk about you. Let's talk about your soul. Like this is an experience that the Torah teaches us happened to every single one of us. My soul at some stage had this conversation, made this promise. Now let's understand, what is this promise? Because clearly it's tied into why I'm in this world, what I'm trying to accomplish. So I'm just going to close this screen share for a second. If I'm going to analyze this promise, I have a lot of questions about this. This is not a very simple line that we're told. I mean, for starters, what was I promising? What does it actually mean? I'm going to be righteous. Like, how do you define that? And secondly, an oath is pretty powerful. You're not, according to Jewish law, you're not supposed to promise something that you don't have the ability to fulfill. So if I had to make a promise that I'm going to be righteous, is that even possible? Like, I don't know, what if I can't be so righteous? What if I could just be a mediocre person? Like, why do I have to make this promise? Another question you might ask is, it doesn't sound like I had any choice. It's like I was cornered by the angels and they told me I need to make a promise, so I made a promise. So what's the point of a promise if it was forced upon me and it's not even something that I chose to make. Now, for those who have studied Jewish texts, it's a very Jewish thing to start with a lot of questions. And when you start asking questions and analyzing things, it really allows you to unlock deeper levels. So many times when you're trying to get into the depth of something in Torah study, you'll take a passage or a section and you start asking questions and asking questions and asking questions. And once you've asked so many questions that like your head is spinning and you're like, okay, this like really doesn't make sense, then you can start unlocking the answers. If we don't start with the questions and with that curiosity, it's sometimes hard to get to the essence of things. So the very first section of Tanya, if you continue reading, asks tons of questions. How do we make this promise? And how's it possible? And what is this promise anyway? But clearly we're trying to understand this is tied in with my mission in life and my purpose in life. And if I could understand what the nature of this promise was, then I can understand what I'm doing here and what God is expecting me to do here. So the first thing that I want to point out, which is very powerful, I'm going to pull it up on a slide for those who read Hebrew. Hang on 1 second. Okay. The word that's used for making a promise is the word mashbia. That's the first word over here on the right side. Mashbia means to make a promise, an oath. If you take the same word, but instead of reading it with a shin, you read it with a sin. So you read it as masbia. Masbia is the Hebrew word that means satiated, satisfied. And the first thing that we're taught is that the nature of this promise is that my soul at that moment, yes, it was making a promise, but more than that, it was being masbia, it was being satiated and given the powers to fulfill this promise. So it wasn't simply making a promise, but it was like being uploaded with all the power in the world to tackle my life journey. We know that our life journey was preordained. Before our soul entered this world, our life challenges were already spelled out. It's not like, oh, whoops, there's a fluke in the system, something happened, and now I have to face this challenge. God knew what these challenges were from the beginning. And from the very beginning, before our body even entered this world, we were given all the power that we need to handle our personal life's journey. So that's a very powerful concept where, yes, we're told you have to be good. You got to do the right thing. And in the same moment, we're told your soul was empowered. Like you entered this world with both a promise and a commitment to doing the right thing, and also with all the power that you will ever need to make those right choices in life. So that's the introduction. But still, come on. I mean, I made this promise when I don't even remember, right? Like it's a promise that I made before I was born. And all the challenges that I face are faced when my soul is in my body, when I'm actually going about life. How is it that a promise that my soul made on a spiritual level, something that I don't remember and didn't physically have part of, how could that affect me in my day-to-day life? Any thoughts? Those who are into psychology or early childhood education might have thoughts on this. Yeah, Lisa.
By the way, this is my last day having thoughts because I go back to school.
When do you start school?
And then I'm going to be tired. But anyway, my thought was that I went through a hard time with something. And if God is with us, we can get through anything. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind, is that God helps us through the tough times. And to be righteous, we're born to be righteous. People do turn bad, but most of us are born to be good people.
100%. I would add to that and say that, today psychology tells us that experiences that we had in our youth and even before birth affect us on a subconscious level. They've done studies on children whose, mothers went through very difficult things while they were pregnant. And later, the child, you know, sometimes the child, it affects the child in their life. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you don't see it. But the Torah has always told us that we are very deeply affected by our soul and by our soul's experiences even before we came into the picture as physical beings. So the knowledge that my soul had this experience means that on a spiritually subconscious level, even if it's not something I'm aware of consciously, my soul made this promise and my soul was given these powers. And that alone is enough to give me a power. There's a hidden power in my soul to get through life and to overcome all these challenges. Now, my challenge is to tap into these powers because I don't see them or feel them when I go through life. But when I know that I'm like basically being told that my soul was supercharged before I got here. So I am dealing with an Aton, with a very, very powerful force inside me that could get me through everything. So yes, it's something that happened before I was born, but actually it's a tremendous empowerment. Firstly, that I have it. And secondly, when I know about it, it's like, you know, when I deal with a challenge and I say, wait, I know that my soul was made for this. Like my soul was prepared for this. The programming was already put in. Now I just need to tap into that. Yes, someone wants to say something? So if you keep reading again, we said now that Tanya is going to go into a series of questions about this promise. I want to read one of them inside because I find that one very relevant. Yes, Marina.
Well, I always try to bring this into modern language. And I was wondering if it's talking about being born with a moral sense, that's what makes us, that's what differentiates us from the animal.
Okay.
And
you
and
that?
I'm sorry.
No, explain that a little more.
Well, that we are physical beings and we have a animal nature, but we also have a moral nature, a higher nature that
100%.
we are also born with. We come with those two natures.
100%. You're getting straight into
into
Tanya.
into this world. So, but just to begin with, I'm just thinking about just having a moral sense. And sometimes, as I love what you said about having the power to live that moral life. It's very, very difficult to live a moral life, more difficult than most of us realize.
Right, 100%. No, you're totally right. And that's really what the Tanya is getting into. It wants to make us aware of what our inner spiritual nature is. And it will talk about those two parts of us, that natural part of us, and then the holy supernatural part of us. But we're jumping ahead of ourselves for a minute. We're going to ask another question before we start delving into the answers. So Tanya says, 1 second. So we made a promise. I'm going to be good. I'm going to do the right thing. Even if I assume that I understand the first part of that promise, the second part of that promise is a little confusing. The Talmud tells us that the second part of the promise was, even if the whole world tells me that I am righteous, I should still consider myself wicked. Well, for starters, since when's the whole world like coming to tell people that they're righteous? But, you know, we can say, let's say life, you know, life makes me feel, you know, sometimes we feel really good. I'm doing the right thing. I feel like I'm making a difference. And we're kind of being warned, like, don't get too excited when that happens. You should still consider yourself not righteous. So what's that trying to tell us? And the Tanya specifically asked, and this is what I found very interesting, this question, the Tanya says, furthermore, if a person considers himself wicked, he will be grieved at heart and depressed. I mean, we know today, right, people go through affirmations every day to tell themselves that I'm a good person and I can do this. And, you know, whatever we tell ourselves, because we know that what we believe about ourselves affects us. Again, those of us with young kids know that if a child is told from when he's really young that, you're awful, you're terrible, you're such a troublemaker, whatever it is, the child will start believing that about himself. And at the same time, if someone's told you're so smart and you're so capable and you're amazing and you're so talented, they also start believing that about themselves. So the Tanya says, wait a second, if I'm going to always be telling myself that I'm actually wicked, as the Talmud says, I'm going to become pretty depressed. What's the problem in the Tanya's eyes with becoming depressed? Well, the Tanya continues here, the letters in the yellow, and then he will not be able to serve God joyfully with a contented heart. This is a basic concept in Judaism. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. Judaism tells us, well, a little different than maybe pop culture, that happiness is not a goal, it's not a destination, it's a way of life. In order for you to fulfill your mission in life, you need to go through life happily. Now, if I'm constantly going to be telling myself I'm so awful, I'm so terrible, there's no way that I can go through life happily. Now, as a side note about this this happiness thing, there's a quote from, let me see who the quote is from. I think Reb Aaron of Karlin said this. He said, sadness is not a sin in the Torah, meaning there is a mitzvah we're told serve God with joy. But it doesn't say that being sad is a sin. However, sadness leads to all sins. And I feel like we must have mentioned this recently. I don't know if it was here or another discussion, but we know, when I start feeling really bad about myself, usually it's not a very good motivator. The Tanya later on, there are other chapters that talk a lot about sadness and depression at length. But the general belief is that when I'm feeling really sad and depressed, it's really a tactic of my evil inclination to derail me from what I'm supposed to be doing. When that evil voice inside me knows or sees that it has no power over me. I know what I'm doing it right, I'm a go-getter. So then it's like, okay, well, time to use a different tactic. What if I make her feel really, really awful about something real, about something that she did? We're all human. We all mess up. We make mistakes. So I do something wrong and I start really feeling really terrible about it. Naturally, what am I going to do? Probably just give up, throw in the towel. Who cares anyway? It's not working, Like if I'm let's say I'm on some kind of diet where I'm trying to avoid sugars and refined carbs, and one day I slip up and I eat a donut for lunch. My natural reaction might be, all right, forget it. Just bring the whole box. That's not working out today, right? Whatever, it's human nature. When we start feeling bad about ourselves, naturally, we just kind of give up and we stop trying too hard. So in Judaism, being happy is a very important part of serving God, of being able to do things joyfully. Now, how exactly you tap into that happiness, that's a long discussion later on in Tanya. But here the Tanya says it's a basic question. We're being told that we need to think of ourselves as evil. Of course we're going to be miserable, and there's no way we're going to be able to serve God with joy. So how is it possible that we're being commanded this? And then there's the flip side. Just in case you thought that Judaism wants us to be these happy people who are totally out of touch and, not real and not in tune with our emotions, the Tanya says, if his heart will not be grieved, what if someone says, okay, fine, I will consider myself evil and I will make sure that it doesn't get me down? Well, then, what's going to happen then? Then he may be led to irreverence, God forbid, meaning I'll become apathetic. If I convince myself that I'm an awful person, and at the same time I make sure that I'm not sad about it, then I'm a fake. Like, I can't be in touch with my real self. And I'm just going to become this person who goes about life, not feeling, not caring, without any passion. And that's also not the way we're supposed to be living. So the Tanya is trying to analyze this and say, one second, like, how am I supposed to be perceiving myself here? And how do I make sure to remain on one hand, a happy person, and at the same time, a real, caring, passionate person who's really in touch with themselves and in touch with their emotions. Any questions before we go on to the next section? Yes, Harriet.
So as you're talking, what I'm thinking about is when you're on either extreme, happy or depressed, that trusting in Hashem is not part of how you connect, of being in relationship with Hashem, and that finding that balance of trusting Hashem, recognizing what's going on, but trusting Hashem is kind of that awareness of we're not in control.
You're right. The Tanya taps into this idea a lot where, you know, Judaism tells us, you know, we have 613 commandments. We're told what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live our lives. But the Tanya focuses a lot on being real people. Like, we've also got emotions. And Judaism is not intended to squash those emotions or take them away or make us out of touch with them. You know, if I walk through life and just say, I trust in God, I trust in God, I trust in God. And I mean, I'm human. Like, there's no way that there's a part of me that's not worried or concerned. I can't pretend that my emotions are not there. So the Tanya talks a lot about working within our emotions, becoming the term that's used a lot in Hasidic teachings is panimi. Panimi translates in Hebrew to, it's hard to translate. It kind of means like an internal person, but it means like an internally connected person, an internally tuned in person. Like, Judaism is not just externals. It's also not just internal, meaning, you know, we have two sides to that. There's people who say, well, I'm a Jew at heart, right? And I know we've mentioned this before, but I think there's a quote from Rabbi Emanuel Shachat. Someone once told him that, and he's like, you're a Jew at heart? Oh my goodness, I'm afraid you're gonna have a heart attack. Like, that is a lot to carry in your heart, you know? Like, Judaism is a big thing. And we know that we have 613 commandments, and the commandments are all very practical. Like, there's a way we're supposed to live our lives practically. And the Tanya really strives to kind of strike a balance where, yes, I need to work on doing the right thing, but I also need to remain tuned into and connected to what's going on inside me and work with and work through my emotions. And this kind of hints to that, where it says like, okay, I got to be happy, but if I'm just happy and I'm feeling horrible, so then I'm just becoming apathetic, and that's definitely not good. Yes, Arlene.
I don't know. I guess I'm taking it too literally, but from what we just read from the Mishnah, I need a lot of explaining as to how do you become a joyful person when you're told to regard yourself as otherwise, even if you are respected as being a good, righteous, joyful person. And then I don't know, I just feel like there's a lot of explaining that needs to be done for me to understand how this is going to contradict the Mishnah or pull apart some layers so we can see what the Mishnah is actually saying, because just taking it literally, it's hard for me to fathom.
100%. But what you're asking is exactly the question that Tanya is asking. The Tanya is starting with exactly your question and saying, clearly there are layers that we have to peel back here. We need to get to like the inside of this, you know, the bottom line. What's really expected of me? Like, what kind of life am I supposed to be living? How am I supposed to regard myself? What am I really striving for? Is it possible to strive for perfection, to be a righteous person? Like, what does that even mean? And if I feel like I can't get there, how do I not just become depressed about that? Like, what? And again, it's starting, like we said, it's starting with all these questions because it wants to get us thinking about all these things before it starts presenting us with you know, this new view and this deeper approach to life. So really after, it's like kind of halfway, you know, not even halfway through the first chapter, the Tanya says, okay, so we have all these questions. Let's start from the beginning. And what the Tanya is going to attempt to do now is give us the anatomy of our soul. It's a little bit like if someone goes to medical school and they have a lot of things that they want to solve. They want to, you know, find a cure for cancer but they spend their first year in medical school, and what are they doing? They're just learning terminology. These are all the body parts, and this is how they work. And, you know, these are all the tools that you use, and these are all the things that you don't use, and these are the protocols, and a lot of like basic language before they could get into the depth of what they're trying to do and how they're trying to get there. So similarly, the first few chapters of Tanya, in a way, I mean, they're practical because they have like practical application, but the first few chapters of Tanya are really attempting to kind of lay out the inner anatomy of our soul for us. Like, who am I? What is inside of me? What are these forces that are inside of me? What am I trying to do? What does God want me to do? Once I can understand and I have some language for the inner makeup of my soul and my spiritual self and a little bit of the world around me, then it's at chapter 9 where it really starts becoming very practical and says, okay, so now that you have the lingo and you understand the map, now let's talk about the day-to-day struggles and how we tackle them. So the first thing that Tanya does right here in the chapter is, let's talk about the soul. Yes, Lorraine.
So I have to add on to Arlene because, I mean, I'm right there with you. I'm shaking my head going, I'm not going to tell myself that I'm not righteous. I'm not going to tell myself that I'm not a good, joyful, happy person serving God with a song in my heart. I'm not going to tell myself all those things. Why would I want to slam down my joy and my self-esteem and my ability to serve God by thinking I'm this horrible person? Like, I wouldn't think that. I would think that would be counterintuitive to getting me. I can only speak for me, but it sounded like Arlene was kind of going there with me. In order for me to serve God, I have to believe I'm a good human and I'm serving God. Am I following you, Arlene?
Yeah,
Kind of.
No, 100%. But I wonder if we have to make a distinction. The Tanya is not stating these facts. The Tanya is quoting pieces of Talmud. The Tanya is telling us, well, we learned this here and we learned this here. And now I'm going to ask the same question as Lorraine and Arlene. What are we supposed to do with this information? Because we know it can't possibly be taken at face value. So we're not supposed to be closing chapter 1 in Tanya and say, I'm supposed to be a miserable person. We're supposed to close chapter 1 in Tanya and say, wait a second, there's some deep stuff that I need to figure out here so I can truly understand what's being expected of me. So the Tanya is very much echoing your questions. It's getting into the main point by starting off with questions. When we start off with a lot of questions, you know, I mean, who's our teacher here? Lisa, you're a teacher. You know, when you want to give a great lesson, the first thing you want to do is get people curious, get them interested, make them ask a bunch of questions. And when they have a lot of questions, then you could say, oh, wait a second, let me start showing you some interesting things. So that's kind of what the Tanya is doing. Exactly. It really wants to kind of get us a little bit unsettled and say, all right, so let's dig a little deeper.
And I feel like the Talmud and Tanya were written by man. And we have our own belief systems. And whoever wrote these scripts they had their belief systems. So we're all trying to wrap our brains around this when we've had our own belief systems to get us through life.
So I do want to clarify that a little bit. When you understand where the Talmud comes from, nothing that's written in the Talmud or the Tanya is something that somebody, you know, woke up and said one day. The general, you know, I don't want to get into a whole discussion, but in general, there's two parts of the Torah. There's what we call the written Torah and the oral tradition. When Moses taught the Jewish people Torah, he spent 40 years in the desert teaching them Torah. And then he left them with the Torah scroll that has the 5 books of Moses on it. Now, there's no way that that scroll contained everything he had been teaching them all of those years. It's a little bit like when you attend a university course and you have a text and the professor teaches, right? If I borrow the textbook from you after a whole semester, there's probably very little chance that I'm going to pass the test just by reading the textbook. I had to really have been in the class to understand the context, the background, the examples, and the much richer part of it. So what the Jewish people got, those 5 books of Moses, the Torah we hold up in the synagogue, that's the written Torah. But the entire time, the Jewish people were constantly reviewing and studying the oral Torah that they were taught by Moses. And in every generation, there was a reason that all of that wasn't written down. Part of it was, just like let me see what Lorraine says. Lorraine says, Eileen is a master level teacher and wrote Jewish curriculum with children with special needs. Many said that.
Okay, that was for you.
Okay.
I wrote it directly to Deanie, not to the whole group.
Oh, I'm sorry. So wait, but I'm sorry. Sorry for reading that out loud. But Eileen, we're gonna have to get your perspective on this too. But if let's say the lecturer in this example, the university lecturer, just kind of wrote down and documented everything that they said, if I were to pick up the notes of everything they said, it still would be different than sitting in their class. There's something you get about a teacher-student relation within a teacher-student relationship that's much richer and much deeper than just reading a text. So part of the reason that so much of the Torah wasn't written down is because it was meant to be studied as a text. It was meant to be that the Jewish people in every generation, parents sit down with their children and teach them, and the children sit down with their children and they teach them. And really, for thousands of years, this is how Jewish tradition was transmitted. We had our written texts, and then we spent all day and all night transmitting Torah. It really, once the Second Temple was destroyed, it was in that era that, it's a little bit predating the Talmud, right? Before the temple was destroyed, where the rabbis they kind of saw what was happening. They're like, we're in a very difficult situation, because all of this time we were able to transmit our traditions orally, because all Jewish people lived in Israel. Everyone lived in the same place. Everyone kind of lived together. It's very easy to keep things going that way. But if we're facing a situation where our temple is going to be destroyed, Jews are going to be spread out all over the world, I mean, it's not going to last. We're not going to be able to keep this up for future generations. And so at that point, a decision was made to start writing down a lot of these teachings. So the Mishnah and the Talmud are recordings of sages who had been studying these things for years, documenting all of these teachings. And they always say, they're like, well, I study this from my father, from my rabbi, from, in the name of so-and-so. And that's what the Mishnah and the Talmud are. So yeah, the Talmud says a lot of things that might be difficult to understand, but I first have to understand this is a Jewish teaching that's been passed down for generations. I need to understand now, how do I make sense of this? Which is the Tanya's approach here. It's not saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. It says, well, clearly it has to be true because this was transmitted Jewish tradition. But if it's not making sense to me, I have to dig deeper to really understand what was being given over here. What was the Talmud trying to say with these statements? Does that clarify? I just don't want anyone walking away thinking there is this misconception that, oh, the Talmud, it's just a bunch of stuff rabbis made up and wrote down. Like it's very much a misconception, and it changes the way you approach Torah study when you think of it that way.
Well, what happens when they conflict with each other?
What happens when the statements conflict with each other? Well, that's why studying Talmud's a lot of fun, because there's a lot of conflicting things, and the Talmud is written really as a recording of the dialogue of how they're trying to resolve the conflict. I always studied this. My teachers always told me X, Y, and Z. And then you get up and you say, well, I saw, Moses himself doing something that's contradictory. And then a whole discussion ensues, how is it possible? And they don't stop till they get to the bottom of it. which is why one discussion in Talmud could go on for like pages and pages and pages. But at the end, typically, there's an understanding that usually is on a deeper level. Well, he was looking at it from this angle. He was looking at it from that angle. This person was in that kind of situation, and that's why it was okay. That's why it was okay for them. The other person was in a different situation, and that's why their ruling was the opposite of that. But that's exactly what, they say Jews always ask a lot of questions, and we always answer questions with questions. It's always been the Jewish way of studying things, like keep asking questions, and don't stop asking till you get your answers. And the more questions you have to ask, that means you're just digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And when I believe strongly that the Torah is true, that God is true, then I know I'm not afraid to ask questions, because I know the more I ask, the deeper I'll go. And at the end, I will reach an answer. There's going to be an answer to every question. Yes, Harriet.
So thinking about walking into a classroom and planning how to teach is an awareness that you have students with different learning needs and that you have to speak to them on multiple different levels. And I'm wondering if some of the what seems like contradictions, are addressing people who are wicked all of the time and need major correction, and people who try to be good but sometimes screw up. And just thinking in terms of how there are times that I act better and times that I act worse, that the messages need to be different at different times, and whether some of that's what we're seeing reflected. And I don't know if that was
no,
how I
100%.
thought about that.
100%. A lot of times the conflict is resolved in that way, where it's like, wait a second, who said opinion A and who said opinion B? Let's examine what was their life circumstance, what was their background, where were they living, under what circumstances were they making these statements? And once you understand that, then it becomes clear, okay, so now I can see where the different, perspectives are from. Now, still, again, this is like another discussion, but there is something called a halachic ruling. Like, a basic example. One example of constant contradiction in the Talmud is the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were two great sages. They were, lived in the same time. They each had their own study halls, and they had very, very different methods of studying. And on basically everything, they disagreed. We'll take a basic example like Hanukkah. How do you light the Hanukkah menorah? The house of Shammai said, well, there's 8 days. On the first day, you light 8 candles. And on the second day, you light 7. And on the third day, you light 6. And finally, on the last day, you only light 1. And the house of Hillel said, no, you start with 1, and then you do 2, and there's a lot of discussion. And it's fascinating when you really dig into it to understand what worldview the house of Shammai had, that this was their approach to life, and what worldview the life of Hillel had. The life of the house of Shammai looked very much at potential. So the house of Shammai said, on the first day of Hanukkah, there are 8 days of potential in front of you. So you're going to light 8 candles to reflect the 8 potential, lights that are right here in front of you. And then on the second day, there's a little less. On the third day, there's a less. On the last day, you're at your last day. Make the most of it. And the house of Hillel looked differently and said, no, we have to look at it about how we approach life, that every day we need to try to do more than the day before. So the first day we start with 1, and the second day we start with 2. Practically speaking, after the whole discussion, the house of Hillel won the debate, and halacha was ruled, Jewish law rules according to the house of Hillel. So today, there's not a single Jewish community anywhere that lights 8 candles on the first night of Hanukkah. It's, you know, it's an accepted ruling. At the same time, we still study it to help us understand just perspectives and how we can better understand the deeper parts of Judaism and the deeper messages that are going on. So, you know, that's, again, just an example of, you have two very conflicting things, but when you start understanding what are their backgrounds, what message are they trying to give over, sometimes a decision has to be made. Do we follow this one or do we follow this one? But we do attempt to understand all of it, because that allows us to get to the bottom, to really understand what is Judaism all about. I know we're at 8:55, and I don't want to, we're not going to get through the whole, you know, soul anatomy today, but I don't want to log off before we at least do the basics. And the Tanya in chapter 1, after asking all these million questions, so now we're all curious and our head spinning, we're like, okay, so let's lay out some basic things that we can understand the words of what we're going to be working with. So the first thing that Tanya tells us is that typically, traditionally in Judaism, people are often referred to by 3 types. These are mentioned all over in Judaism. You hear of the tzaddik. The tzaddik is typically defined as the righteous person, the amazing, great person, to the extent that you'll have parents who are so proud of their little boy or little girl, they say, "Oh my God, you're such a tzaddik, right? You're amazing." Then there is the opposite of tzaddik, a rasha. A rasha typically is defined as just an evil person. And the third type is a Benoni. A Benoni literally means an in-betweener, an average guy. Which again, most people think are like, okay, someone who's like, you know, I guess sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. They fall somewhere in between. The Tanya says in order to understand anything, we first have to change the definition on all of these. Now, the Tanya says you're still going to see it referenced differently in other parts of Judaism, in other parts of Torah, but it just, for the sake of our conversation, I want to define these 3 terms so that we can start talking about soul makeup and life mission and action. And the Tanya defines these in a very specific way. The Tanya says a tzaddik, person number 1, is a person who is perfect, inside and out, meaning externally they're perfect. They only do the right thing. They never, ever, ever, ever mess up. And internally, they're also perfect. They're so refined that they don't even desire to do anything awful. Never. They don't even want to slap someone. And they don't even have to control themselves, because all they want is good, you know. And really, the Tanya defines this as a very lofty type of individual. That's not the norm. And the Tanya says no one that we're talking to, for the most part, is a true tzaddik by this definition. You know, Moses was a tzaddik. It's like one in a generation. There's some great leader. They have a different kind of soul. That's a tzaddik. But no one should ever expect themselves to become this definition of a tzaddik. It's not even expected of us. It's a certain type of person that God creates in the world for a specific purpose. Now let's go to the opposite extreme, a rasha. The Tanya says a rasha is a person who messes up. They might mess up a lot of times. They might mess up some of the time, but they're definitely imperfect in their actions. And the third person, the Benoni, the Tanya says, this person is interesting. Externally, they're perfect. Their actions are perfect. They will always make the right decision. But internally, they're very conflicted. Meaning they wake up in the morning and they constantly they're like, should I do this? Should I do this? I want to do this, but I know I really shouldn't. Like they have all of those desires, but ultimately they always make the right decision. So this person can't say I am perfect, but they could say I do perfect. Now, the Tanya says, what I'm going to explain to you is that our goal is not to become a tzaddik. It's not to become a person who never has any desires to do anything awful, because that's not even human. Our goal is to become a Benoni, to become that person who is fully, fully in control. They might want to do the wrong thing all of the time, but they figure out how to use the tools that they were given to make the right decision all the time. And that's really our goal. That's why the Tanya is called the book of the Benoni, the book of the in-betweener. And the Tanya says, I want you to know that this is really possible for every person. You're never going to change your inside. You're always going to have desires and thoughts that shouldn't be there. And that's okay. You don't have to feel awful about it. That's just part of being human. But I will teach you methods and tools that you can actually be in full control. You know, it's like you want to get a ride with someone and you want to make sure that they're a good driver, right? So, you know, the person could tell you a few things, right? They could say, well, you know, I'm a perfect driver. I have a perfect driving record. I'm always, you know, always alert, never had any accidents, never had any fender benders. Or the person could tell you, well, I don't know, sometimes I drive well and sometimes I don't drive well. I don't know, it depends on the day. Like different things, different days are a little different. Or the person could say, look, I'm not going to tell you I'm a perfect driver and a perfect driving record, but I want you to know that I take my driving very seriously. I know all the rules. I'm very alert on the road. I always have my handles on the wheels. And most of the time, I'm a perfectly good driver because I'm fully in control when I'm driving. That's kind of where we're aiming to. We want to aim to be a person who's always in control. It's kind of like we said last time, you know, we always say nobody's perfect, but how would we feel if our spouse was sometimes imperfect in their moral behavior? Like 1 second, like some things that are like we're not okay with them not being perfect. I'm okay if you're not a perfect human, if you sometimes mess up. I'm okay if my kids don't, you know, get hundreds on their tests. I'm okay if, you know, my friend has a bad day and they sometimes yell and whatever, I'll forgive them. But there's certain things that like, I expect the people close to me and around me, like, you know, my business partner can never cheat on me. If my business partner is dishonest in business even once, that's not okay. Like that's not the imperfection that we're okay with. So the Tanya says, this is the same approach we have to life. We don't expect anyone to be perfect, but we could expect of ourselves to do perfect. And I'm going to show you how. And next time we'll continue in chapter 1. Next time is where the Tanya starts analyzing where do all those feelings and emotions and desires come from? It's going to like break down for us that actually there are 2 souls inside of us, and each soul is coming from a different source. And because of the source of each of these souls, these animating forces inside of us, we have 2 very strong forces inside of us that are constantly conflicting. And that's okay. That's human. That's part of how we were built. And once I understand what these forces are, where they come from, and what their goals are, then I could start understanding how I can manage these different forces that are happening inside me. And when I wake up in the morning and I feel like doing X, where's that feeling coming from? And what am I supposed to do about it? And what am I expected to do about it? And when I was, you know, and right before I was born, I said, I'm going to be good. I didn't mean I'm going to become a perfect person, but I did mean that I'm going to, in every situation, work on making the right decision every single time, regardless of how many different internal conflicts I'm facing at the time. So just as we stop, I just want to quickly review. We spoke about the fact that we've been energized. You know, we have a very, very powerful, supercharged soul that is energized and ready to overcome any obstacle we face in life. We also spoke about the fact that we're supposed to live life joyfully. That's very clearly a Jewish way of living life, is we're supposed to be joyful and we're supposed to work on being joyful. And in order for us to be able to navigate the life that we have, the better we understand ourselves internally, the more we're able to actually make the right decisions all the time. And we're in the middle of analyzing and understanding what is this inner soul makeup that we have. Thoughts or questions, feel free to stay on and discuss. Anyone who needs to sign off, have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Deanie. Very thought provoking.
I like the last thought that you said about we don't have to be perfect, we have to do perfect, because that puts all the power back in our hands. Like, I definitely am not a perfect human, but in any given circumstance, I can choose the right kind, I won't go as far as righteous, but the right and kind way to be. And so I like that distinction, that I will never be perfect, but I can strive to do perfect. That's a good differentiation for me.
Awesome. Eileen, I wanted to hear your perspective on the teaching part.
Oh my God, I'm never writing you a private note again. Because Eileen is going to kill me, because Eileen is so modest. And so I'm trying to do this surreptitious thing. I send it just to Deanie, and it says, Eileen is a master level teacher too. She wrote Jewish curriculum all over Dallas, and she did that. And Deanie starts reading it out.
I think next time you have the first words you have to type is do not read out loud. Because I just see it pop up on my screen. I have to look very carefully to see that it was like message just to me. I thought it was like a group discussion.
Okay, sorry, Eileen. I outed you. Sorry.
We learn visually, we learn auditorially, and we learn by doing. And I feel like tonight in our class, we learned that way. I think you presented everything to our different modes of learning, and we can all benefit from visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning. So I learned a lot.
And I think the question was that Deanie was asking is, when you start your class, and I do with kindergarten even, we turn and talk, and I present them a question, and they turn and talk with each other, and they answer the question to each other. And by the end of the year, they're having a discussion. And that's what Deanie was asking the teachers. Wasn't anything real profound. It's just, do we start with a question? And that's what you've been doing. And that's great, because we get to think.
100%. But it's not just what I'm doing. It's really the Tanya's doing that. It's like you read the first page and you're like, okay, stop asking so many questions. I want to know the answers already. Some of the questions don't really get answers to like, many, many chapters in. But it's starting with that, the starting point is there's a lot that we need to dig deeply into. In case I thought that I had this Judaism thing figured out. Well, actually, let me ask you some questions. You're going to see that there's a lot of things that aren't so clear.
Right. That quote from the Mishnah about, even if everyone tells you that you're righteous, you aren't, don't believe it and whatever. It's just, it's such a downer, and it's such a turnoff. And if somebody is reading it and doesn't go beyond that, what are they left with?
100%. That's why we say that the Jewish holiday that's all about education is Passover, right? That's the holiday where we're supposed to give over our traditions to the next generation. How do we start the Passover Seder? Like, we start with questions. We want the kids to start asking questions. And you'd say, 1 second, like, that doesn't make sense. This is the night that we're giving over our traditions. We're supposed to sit the kids down and say, listen, guys, this is what happened. This is where we come from. This is our mission in life, and questions at the end. But that's not how we start the Seder. We start with the questions. And the deeper message in that is you have to ask questions to understand. And when you don't understand, ask questions. Like, there's a misconception. I think it comes maybe from other religions about, some things you're not supposed to ask. I know a woman who, she grew up, her father was a rabbi in, I think it was Nashville, Tennessee. And, she grew up and she was a kid in like the 40s and 50s. And she said she remembers like people in their community saying, oh, the rabbi's kids, they probably sit around the dinner table and, the rabbi gives a speech every night at dinner and all the kids have to nod their heads and say, yes, dad, yes, yes. I know. And she says it's such a misconception. Like that's not how Jewish people raise their kids. We teach them from the very beginning. Ask questions, ask questions. If I don't know the answer, we're going to find someone else who can help us answer, because part of asking the question is believing that there is an answer. In a way, not asking questions is actually lack of faith. Because if I truly believe that this is true, then I believe there's going to be an answer. And if I'm afraid to ask a question, that's because I'm afraid that I'm gonna shake things up here, and then maybe it's all gonna come falling apart and crumbling. So it's very important to ask questions, and that's a Jewish way of study, but that's a Jewish way of life. That's also why I say I don't want anyone to ever be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes it may not be the right moment in the middle of a certain discussion, but please, if you have questions, if you have thoughts about what we're learning about other things, ask them. I can't promise to always know the answers, but I could definitely try to help you get some of those answers.
Thank you, Deanie. That was great. Thank you.
Francis, it was so nice to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night,
Great,
everyone.
great class.
Good
Thank
night.
you, Deanie.
Yes.
We'll
Good
see you.
night. Thank you, Deanie. Thank you. It was good, really good.